Thank you, Tristan, for bringing that song to life for us here today. American Tune is a meditation on the American experience by, of course, the great singer and songwriter Paul Simon. And thank you to Nancy for sharing her story, full of hope and vulnerability of her journey with her beloved daughter. Nancy's story and American Tune evoke the idea of grand promises, one in becoming a parent of a young life, and the other promise of opportunities in our country, contrasted with the hard realities of living into those promises. These realities are too often formed by oppressions perpetuated in our culture, whether it is racism or classism or sexism or ableism, or more likely some combination that is hard to name but profoundly felt. The lament captured in American Tune is embedded in the song's history. The melody comes from an old Christian hymn called "O Sacred Head, Now Wounded," referring to Jesus' head that carried a crown of piercing thorns. This Christian hymn contrasts Jesus' commandment to love one another with a lament about the cruelty of his death. Paul Simon's version, American Tune, was written just as Nixon was elected and our country was entangled in Vietnam, both overseas and at home. Journalist Jeffrey Fleshman of the LA Times writes of it, "The song is a lament to a country that had lost its way, and a sobering recognition that you can't be forever blessed." Then in 2022, at the Newport Folk Festival, Paul Simon reintroduced American Tune. He invited a new singer, Rhiannon Giddens, to sing the song. Rhiannon Giddens is an American musician known for her eclectic folk music, and she is a Black woman. So Simon also adjusted the lyrics to include these lines. "We didn't come here on the Mayflower. We came on a ship in a blood-red moon." Pastor Tommy Eyre notes, many of the ancestors of Rhiannon Giddens and multitudes of other Americans did not come here on the Mayflower. Some were already here. Some came on slave ships. Some walked thousands of miles north. The blood-red moon is a reference to Joel, a prophetic book in the Hebrew Bible that says the sun will turn dark and the moon will turn to blood on the terrible day when the people of the land lose their sense of love and justice. This new version of American Tune, how many of you have heard it? I'm curious. It's hauntingly beautiful. It expands the immigration narrative to include people who were enslaved, indigenous people, all of us, all the people who lament the American dream and the American reality. It does not pretend that everything is just fine. It holds our hopes and it makes space for our collective grief. Adjusting our version of history, our understanding of reality to include the suffering of others whose identities we do not share is a small example of how we begin to change our world. When we liberate a single narrative and expand it to acknowledge the grief we collectively share, it is a step towards healing. It is a step towards love. Because to build collective liberation, we must not only understand ourselves, we must understand the other. Liberating love is love that shapes the world into a just and equitable place for all. Nancy's journey with her daughter, Her story is one of liberating love. Guided by a hopeful and determined love, their relationship leads them to expand their understanding of one another, their realities, and shared dreams for the future. Now, in the spring of 2019, after a long haul of study and internships and striving to manage home and school, I graduated, finally, from seminary. Thank you. It was a while ago. Now, my family was really looking forward to a summer of rest and finally some more play together, and my heart was filled with powerful learnings and experiences and a belief in this new career of ministry and the opportunities it would offer to grow hope and nurture change for a community that I would serve. And I had even secured a job to begin directing religious education here at First Church. And then early in June, I promptly broke my leg, badly. And instead of rest and relaxation, we had a summer of struggle in store for us. And during that time of isolation, I craved the outdoors in ways I had never experienced before. And due to the nature of my injury, getting outside, much less to the beach, was almost impossible. But in late July, we discovered that there was a beach in Racine that had installed a wheelchair-accessible mat on the beach. And this mat allowed my family to get me from the car into the sunshine of the Lake Michigan shoreline. Now, my heart just about burst with joy. It made me so unbelievably happy to be there soaking in the sun, viewing the water and all the activities on the beach. And as I sat there observing the world, grateful for that extra long beach mat, I noticed something. The mat was not just being used by people like me that needed it for access to the beach, but it was also being used by parents with strollers and able-bodied people that just had too much to carry, and children whose feet were too hot from the sand. That mat made everybody's path easier. The universal design of that beach mat gave everybody agency to enjoy the lake more. That simple addition of a mat expanded accessibility to all. Now, universal design is the idea that we can shape an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age or size or ability or disability. In a way, it's our UU theology in design, an act of universal love, housed in considering the diverse needs and abilities of all throughout the design process. So I began to ponder, where else does universal love by design show up in our culture? What are the places that we have come to agree that there is an extra need for care and consideration? I was at the beach and I'm a swimmer, so lifeguards came to mind. The role of a lifeguard is designed to be a kind of universal love role. Collectively, we agree that when someone is in distress, there should be someone there to help them out when they're in the water. But what about the rest of the time? There's an old parable about an old fish and a young fish in the water that goes like this. There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, and one looks at each other and nods, and they smile, and the older fish says, "Morning, friends. How's the water?" And the other two fish nod, and they swim on for a bit, and eventually one of them looks at the other and says, "What the heck is water?" For a young fish, the water is everywhere, so pervasive, so ever-present, that a fish could live its life and not even realize that it's swimming in it. So what's our water? The dominant culture is like the water we swim in, I think. The water that surrounds us so constantly that we can forget we're in the water or under the influence of ideas and values. Ideas such as materialism, bigger is better, or individualism, watch out for number one. This kind of cultural water can be invisible to us, with invisible rules and no lifeguards to protect us or those who are in distress. This water is filled with messages about the right way to do things. And many of the ideas and even motivators for these invisible rules, they're not bad in and of themselves, but taken too far, they can be harmful in creating an oppressive culture that is unwelcoming, even unsafe for so many of us physically, emotionally, spiritually. When we hear the term white supremacy, we think of a system or systems or maybe people that are attempting to oppress and control Black and brown people. I'm hopeful that most of us here do not identify with the idea of white supremacy. Yet, white supremacy culture is part of the dominant culture we swim in. And there are ideas and ways of being that we have internalized. They are ways that we perpetuate oppression. In seminary, I became aware of a paper by Tema Okun called White Supremacy Culture. And this paper contains a list of white supremacy characteristics that show up in our organizations, in our world. The author writes this: culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the time so very difficult to name or identify. The characteristics listed below are damaging because they're used as norms and standards without being proactively named or even chosen by the group. They are damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. Because we all live in a white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in the attitudes and the behaviors of us all. As I sat down with that list, what surprised me was how much of myself I recognized in them. The list of white supremacy characteristics contains ideas, habits of working, moving through the world that I regularly default to or even use to survive. It is not a list of all bad things. It is a list of dominant cultural ideas that are too often not questioned and may be harmful if placed above human relationships and human needs. The trick in using this list is not to weaponize it. It should not harm you. It should not harm others. Its purpose is to make us aware of where we might need to offer more care, more consideration, more liberating love. I believe that personal growth requires doubt, as in, I wonder what I'm not understanding, what I'm not getting quite right. One must feel a little uncomfortable in that doubt, yet hopefully not defensive, able to bravely face an internal conflict by holding the duality of wanting to protect your identity, but also to embrace other identities. In an effort to make myself more aware of these invisible influences, I keep a list of these characteristics on my desks, in my journal, and in my date book. And at the top of the list is perfectionism. Isn't that perfect? The ideal of perfectionism can make mistakes personal. It can equate making a mistake with being bad or wrong, and even prevent us from learning or by trying again. And though we know it is through our mistakes that we do the most learning, perfectionism haunts us. In our story today, Ish, Ramon is blinded to their accomplishments because the drawings are not perfect representations. It is his sister, it is his community who sees the beauty in his creations. Naming his style Ish helps Ramon move past an ideal of what they should be and appreciate the beauty in their own artistic expressions. How many times have we prevented ourselves or others from continuing on a project or believing in a thing or a pursuit because we were haunted by perfectionism? Perfection is a harsh judge that lacks compassion and misses chances to connect and grow. Perfection taps into our fear that we must change ourselves to belong, that being a good human, flawed human, is somehow shameful. Letting go of the idea of perfection means accepting the real human flaws and vulnerabilities, ours and others, make space for vulnerability, connection, compassion, certainly humor, joy, and liberating love. Second on the list of the white supremacy characteristics is a sense of urgency. Remember, I'm not saying there is never a sense of urgency. I'm sure we can all imagine times when urgency is quite necessary. Having spent some time as a chaplain working in an emergency room, I know urgency can be quite real. However, a sense of urgency is not an emergency. It is rushing to read through a poem. It is clearing the table before the meal is over, and it's so prevalent in our culture. A sense of urgency is when we approach our endeavors focused primarily on getting something done, especially if it's hard to do. Concentrating on getting it done now can sacrifice the time needed to be inclusive or encouraging to others. Moving through the world with a sense of urgency prevents us from giving ourselves, as well as others, the time to consider long-term consequences. A sense of urgency creates reactive decision-making or criticism that can sacrifice the interests of people, especially the needs of marginalized people. It can show up even with the best of intentions. A desire to help now can take action today, can lead to donating items we want to give away or think are needed, rather than taking the time to build a relationship with those in need and discover what help they desire. The urgency then can supplant the purpose of the care offered. In total, Tema Akun names 15 white supremacy characteristics in her article. Each one offers an opportunity to reflect on the ways culture, the water we swim in, affects our thinking and actions, and can perpetuate oppression. Good news. When crafting the sermon, I chose not to center perfectionism or urgency over our time and needs today. So we will not be going through all 15 of them. However, if you are curious, I did put copies of the article, White Supremacy Culture, on the RE table in the Lean House Common Room. When we challenge the norms in our society, question culture that we have internalized, it requires some tenderness and love. Be gentle, not judgmental, to follow love's liberatory path. Love is placed at the center of our Unitarian Universalist values so it can expand and encompass the marginalized. What's love got to do with it? Love releases us from holding on to historical narratives that do not tell the whole story. Love shares laments of anyone who suffers. Love accepts you and you and you, and it whispers to all of us, you belong here. Love considers how actions may not reflect intentions. Love builds more beach mats and lifeguards for every occasion and all kinds of water. Love invites us to live into knowing our interconnectedness and our interdependence. Love needs us to give it time to reveal itself. Love opens our hearts and minds to create more liberating love. Love holds us, holding all we love. And all we have to do is ask, what would love do? Let it be so. Blessed be.